said they were Christians, but they kept hanging out with each other, they kept marrying each other, kept
were they
forming
advancing specific Jewish interests to attain greater political power?
They remained a group, but a sort of submerged group that were not overtly Jewish. See, they didn't, and in fact, they expelled the Jews in 1492 because they didn't want these so-called new Christians to associate with the old Christians.
Well, we're going to move on to Freud in a moment. What were the immigration events of 1924 and then 1965? Because I think they've had a profound impact on today's country, and with more to come. But what happened in 1924 briefly, and then of course 1965, which was also extremely significant.
Well, in the law of 1924 was a major defeat for Jewish organizations. Jewish organizations had basically kept immigration going. If you were taking a poll around 1900, the majority of Americans wanted to end immigration. They thought that we had enough people.
But that's been an attitude that's been going on forever. What happened in 1965? I know that the Jews didn't get the open admissions that happened in 1955. What changed in 1965, which has opened up the borders to Mexico and other places in the Third World?
Well, you had the immigration law of 1965, and again, Jewish groups were the main organizers of the people on that side. I mean, they were the ones funding.
And what do? They changed it so we no longer give preference to people of European extraction.
Right, so that you got rid of all these national origin things, and they started to have quotas for all parts of the world. And as soon as the law was passed, you started to have the activists were trying to get more and more actual numbers. In other words, to bump up the numbers, because the immigration law of 1965 was advertised as not changing the ethnic balance of the country.
Yeah,
I mean, Teddy Kennedy famously said this won't change it.
Yeah, but do they know? Do they design?
I think so, because it's a matter. Well, it's deception or something. I mean, I think that the fact is the activists, as soon as the law was passed, tried to bump the numbers up.
Well,
in other words,
why are both political parties today paralyzed as far as grappling with an issue that's popular with the American people, namely stopping illegal immigration?
It's one of the most amazing things. Yeah.
Is there a Jewish angle to that?
Well, I think the Jewish angle is more difficult to trace at this point. I mean, it is the case that all the major national Jewish organizations are members of the Immigration Forum, which is the major pro-immigration lobby. But you also have a huge, in California, there's a huge involvement of Mexican activists in favor of immigration. Right. But so you have business activists. It's not a simple story anymore.
Yes, right. But now, of course,
and I think you have a feed-forward situation now where the more immigrants you get, the more there's going to be pressure to increase the amount of immigrants.
Well, let me ask you another question about Sigmund Freud, another one of these brilliant Jewish intellectuals, obviously the father of psychoanalysis. You say psychoanalysis, Freud's movement, remains fundamentally an ethnic movement, and we're getting low on time here.
Well, it certainly was at the beginning. All of these psychoanalysts at the beginning. And it remained that way, the core. Again, there were a few non-Jews brought in, like Ernest Jones, but I'm not making this up. This is a lot of people will tell you this. Psychoanalysis is definitely in a downward spiral. I mean, the fact is, 100 years after the so-called Oedipal complex, we have never found it. Nobody's ever found any evidence for it.
So it's a failed science, but of course his reputation remains...
yeah, he was almost elected Man of the Century by Time magazine. Yes, and if you talk to the average person in the street, and they say, who's the most important psychologist ever? Freud would be the #1. And Freud is still regarded as a great scientific figure.
How did he advance specifically Jewish interests?
Well, I think he thought of himself as someone who was battling Western culture. He thought of himself as Hannibal.
So he wanted to deconstruct a lot of myths about what noble, maybe even spiritual myths a lot of Christians cling to as far as the things that motivate them from day to day. Is that right? In other words, he offered a more cynical...
You thought you were motivated by the highest civilization and all that, but you're motivated by the fact that you had the sexual repressions, and that's producing... So in other words, it changes your view of yourself. And as I say, he himself thought of himself as combating Western culture, as someone who's battling this general Hannibal, who's from Carthage against Rome. Rome is the West. Carthage is the East. It's
let me move on, because we have a couple more intellectual movements to cover. Sociology, a new science in the last 100 years, but the Frankfurt School of Social Research. Tell me a little bit about that.
The Frankfurt School of Social Research began in the 1920s in Germany. It was funded by a Jewish millionaire named Weil, I believe, and they established this institute at Frankfurt, at the University of Frankfurt. That's why it was called that. These people were on the political left. They were Marxists. But they were, sort of sophisticated Marxists, and they started to have doubts about Marxism with the rise of Hitler, because that showed that Marxism itself could not appeal enough to these working class people who gravitated to Hitler eventually. Hitler was very popular. So anyway, as soon as Hitler came to power, he expelled them from Germany. They came over to this country. And that's when a lot of their most influential research was done. They wrote a book called The Authoritarian Personality. It's funded by the American Jewish Committee. All the central figures in this movement were Jewish. Max Horkheimer.
Max Horkheimer, you say?
Yeah, he was the head of the Frankfurt School, and then T.W. Adorno was another major player. And the point of the authoritarian personality was that ethnic prejudice is a psychopathology, that there's something wrong. It's not just that you're mean-hearted or have
so it's actually a sign of mental illness.
Mental illness. You're something.
And didn't Freud do the same thing?
It's similar, and they drew a lot on Freud. If you look at the authoritarian personality, there are whole chapters where they, it's very psychoanalytic, but it's a little bit of a twist, and it was more. It had a very large influence because. At that time, you had the rise of the human relations movement, which was basically funded by the ADL and these other Jewish organizations.
ADL.
Yeah, and you started to have all these programs in the school system.
I remember hearing about the authoritarian personality when I was in grade school in New York City. They linked Nazism to. I remember them saying that they were a lower education. They kept making the link between lower education and lower income. Not motivated to anything more than, I guess, I don't know.
I think that actually that's another aspect of Jewish intellectual movements that I haven't really discussed much is this sense of intellectual superiority and moral superiority. But intellectual superiority is right there. In other words, I think Richard Hofstadter famously said that when he's thinking about conservatives, he couldn't think of any idea worth even mentioning. And it was like so far beneath their intellectual level. The only people who were doing any thinking worth considering was the left, and this was the Jewish left, basically.
Well, so it was a social science with a political agenda. Any scientific value at all, or basically a lot of smoke and mirrors?
Well, I wrote a whole long chapter on the authoritarian personality, and I think it's completely muddle-headed. And psychologists from day one, I mean, one of the most interesting things about this is if you go back into the 50s, right after it was published, you had well-known, very, competent psychologists saying, looking at these scales don't make any sense. Well, there's nothing here. But it didn't matter. You see that, and that's the thing about psychoanalysis too. If you go back, you can find guys in around 1912 say, "Where's the evidence? Where's the data?"
Well, same thing with Freud, of course.
Yeah, right? That's what I'm saying. Psychoanalysis, that there was no data for the Oedipal complex, nothing, and so they went for 100 years without feeling any need to come up with any data. It's that is one of the most amazing stories in science, in the history of science, that you have this movement that retains its momentum. This huge influence in the media. Think of all the movies that were made in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s that were psychoanalytic in inspiration.
Well, it fits a pattern that you describe in your book, and that is a lot of these Jewish movies, they have one person who's charismatic, and he's authoritarian, and all the disciples treat him like a god. Am I right? Am I paraphrasing?
That's exactly right.
And that's happened with Freud, Marx, maybe not Marx, but a lot of the subsequent
Marx would try too, but yeah, Boas had this coterie of people who just worshipped him. I mean, from their point of view, he was the most important intellectual ever, period. I mean, Aristotle take a back
How did Judaism in general and Zionism and all the other things escape this sort of scrutiny as far as it being also ethnocentric, which they were at one point decrying among Gentiles, but apparently looking the other way when it came to Jews? How do they manage that intellectual feat?
And we're still seeing that, aren't we? I mean, that is another one of the major stories here, that when it comes to ethnocentrism, we are constantly being told. I mean, if you look at the authoritarian personality, it's a fascinating example. They're talking. They interview someone, and he says, "I don't like Jews" or something like that. But they never talk about Jewish ethnocentrism. I mean, there's a whole...
They don't talk about Jewish ethnocentrism?
They get a 900-page book, and there's not one mention of Jewish ethnocentrism.
Only
yes,
Gentiles.
Jewish ethnocentrism, is the only thing that really kept them together for 3,000 years or whatever. When if you look at the vanguard, the settler movement in Israel, a lot of overtly very racialist stuff. We are superior. Non-Jews are like animals compared to us.
Well, is this the Talmud or something, or later?
I'm talking about the settlers. I mean, there's a lot of these people right now
in Israel.
Yeah, in Israel, that these people have these ideologies.
Well, yeah.
But the ethnocentrism is palpable.
It's
right there.
It's buried. Now I want to move on to the literary world.
Yeah.
Another Jewish intellectual movement, cultural movement, let's say, literary, and that is the New York intellectuals. Now, who were they? When was their heyday, and are they still with us?
Well, they are with us in a sense. I think the heyday was I'd say from the late 1930s through the 50s. You had journals like the Partisan Review, and you had edited by Philip Roth and Philip, and these people.
Philip Roth, and name some others.
No, well, I'm not saying. No, his name was Roth, R-A-H-P, that was the center of it. But it was extremely prestigious. This was not; these people did not have PhDs necessarily, but it grew up to have this incredible prestige and a really big influence in the literary world. And
does it fit that pattern where you have a handful of glorified people with a kind of coterie of
you certainly have this strong net sort of ethnic networking. Where people are pushing each other. People like Seymour Martin Lipset was a sociologist. You had Clement Greenberg, the art critic. You had and there's a sort of second generation people like Saul Bellow. And see the influence now, because these people became anti-Stalinist left. The other thing that we sort of forget here is that even though most Jews, say in the 30s, 40s, 50s, on the left were with the Stalinist, left, but you had a very robust anti-Stalinist left, and they became more anti-Stalinist, although less so than
because anti-Semitism, anti-Jewishness started to emerge.
I think that was a big part of it, but certainly people started to be aware of the crimes of Stalin, and we became indefensible, really.
Now these movements have become fundamentally irrational. Some of these movements. That's what you said.
I think that you look at psychoanalysis. So I'm saying they're irrational in the sense that they pose as science, but they're not. I mean, and that's a classic example. Or look at the authoritarian personality, the convoluted. These scales that don't make any sense. The fact that only right-wing conservative people can be prejudiced when you see these left-wing people who are obviously bigoted in various ways. So it became it was obviously a politically motivated program. You look at Boasian anthropology; it's the same kind of thing where it was like anti-science. It was like we're not going to have any sort of systematic investigations of culture until we can completely get a theory, but they never got a theory. So you just have all these, infinitely variegated cultures, and they're sort of there, and that's the end of it. But you stop thinking in terms of trying to explain those cultural differences. What about genetic differences, for example? Not part of the game anymore.
Now, what
about warfare? Not part of the game.
Now I want to move to more contemporary issues. Of course, we're at war right now. To what extent are Jewish interests? We already covered this.
I've just written a long thing
being
about
furthered by a war in Iraq. We're getting low on time.
We're getting low
on a 1 to 10.
Okay, well, the main thing is that this is the work of the neoconservative movement, and at the very center of the